Good morning. My name is Tom. Welcome to the Rustic log cabin in Northern Maine. If you don't got yourself a coffee, get yourself a coffee and sit down. I'm out in the woodshed. It's where I like to hang out the most. Enjoy the coffee, enjoy the scenery. So get yourself a coffee and sit down and let's enjoy the video together. It's winter time right now, and there's nothing I enjoy more than sitting out here in the woodshed with a hot cup of coffee and just enjoying the morning, getting ready to get some firewood for the firebox. What I wanted to talk about today was some more fire tinders. If you ain't got a coffee, go ahead and get a coffee. But there's a fire tinder that maybe some of us, it's a simple one, but maybe some of us overlook it. And while I was out on my hike here today, I come across one. So I wanted to just bring, we always talk about bird's nest, making a bird's nest, you know, whether it be out of shavings from a feather stick or anything like that. But the actual bird's nest is a good fire starter too. And every once in a while you'll come across the bird's nest, and it's just something to keep in mind. That and a few others. I'll talk about a few others here for a minute. Now, the outside of the bird's nest usually is covered with mud and stuff like that. So that's not overly good. But a lot of times, on the inside of the nest, you will find, like this one here, you see we got mud, then you got the really big stuff that makes up a nest. But on the inside of the nest, you pull this out, and there's a handful of fine, really fine, because that's where the bird's going to lay its eggs, and it wants to, I mean, we're talking, there's the nest, and this is all by itself. Now, maybe not in every nest, but it is in this one. And I've seen it more than once, but this is a really fine bundle of fire starting materials. So if you're going through the woods and you come across the nest, don't just look at it as a bird's nest. It's actually a fire source. It's actually a fire tinder. Right up there with, you know, in this state, the state of Maine, we have cedar trees that are excellent fire starters, white birch trees that everybody loves, and I love a good white birch tree. But the problem with a good white birch tree is they're not on every corner. They're not even in every piece of woods up here. People seem to think that a white birch tree is just everywhere. It's not. Sometimes you get lucky and you get in a white birch forest and they're absolutely everywhere. I know pieces of woods where you could walk 2 miles before you find a white birch tree. So we love our white birch tree, but it doesn't mean that they're absolutely everywhere. But it's not only just the white birch tree that we have. You have yellow birch, you have gray birch, you have the white birch. So there's different... Probably need some more coffee. So there's several different types of birch trees that will produce that bark that we like, the birch bark that everybody covets and all that. But you can't just go around looking for that, because that's the easy stuff. That's the easy pickings. Anybody, if you find a birch tree, should be able to get a fire going from the birch bark. It's just, it's an oil-filled paper is what it is. So it's the Cadillac of fire starting here in Maine. But so is something like this, or chaga. And then, you know, just because you find these materials, you really need to know then how to use them. You know, it's a big thing about, you know, old man's beards and stuff like that, and even the cedar bark. But the problem with some of this fire tinder, it's perfect, but you got to know how to use it. Like if you scrape off if you take your knife and you scrape the bark off a cedar tree, you can get that going if you have charred punk wood or something that's got, or fat wood. You got to have some kind of, you know, if you take your fire rod and just start smacking that cedar bark, you're probably never going to get the cedar bark to light, because even straight off the tree, it's going to have a little bit of dampness to it. So by having fat wood or by having charred punk wood with you, you can take that cedar bark that's really, let's give it 50% good for building a fire versus 100% like a birch bark. But cedar trees, if you're in a cedar swamp, there's lots of them. You don't have to go very far to find a cedar tree, and once you find one, you'll probably find 100 of them. That's the way cedar swamps are. So being able to recognize a cedar tree, being able to know how to deal with its bark is important. Now, if you don't have any fat wood with you, or you don't have any charred punk wood with you, what you want to do is you want to get a big handful, maybe the size of a softball, a big handful. And try to put that, if you got a dry sock with you or something like that, put that in a dry sock or put that in a handkerchief. Some kind of cloth, especially if it's cotton, would be nice so that will suck the moisture away from it. But then after that, take that cedar ball that you've scraped off that tree, put in some kind of a cloth, and then put it inside of your coat under your armpit. And just let it ride there for a while. Let it ride there for an hour, or let it just sit there until you're ready to build a fire. And while that's sitting in there, it's warming up. And because it's warming up, the cotton cloth, or even your clothes, will take the little bit of dampness out of it. And then from there, you can use your fire rod to get that going, or a lighter, or a flint and steel lighter. Any of that stuff will work. Or if you do have a little piece of birch bark that you've managed to find, sometimes you find a little, sometimes you might even have some with you. But what I'm saying is some kind of other secondary source will help you get the cedar bark lit. And there's lots of trees out there, especially in Maine, that carry this kind of bark, that with that technique, you can get a fire source from just about any tree. And keep in mind about your fir trees and about your pine trees. Because the fir trees and the pine trees, that's where you're going to find that fat wood. And here in the state of Maine, you can get yourself into a pine forest and have all kinds of fat wood to work with. So that's just another one. That's why I wanted to bring that up today about a bird's nest. Is the bird, fire tinders can come from just about anything. And it's really important to learn how to use each and every one of them, because each and every one of them will play a part in your skill sets to being an outdoorsman. Because you never know what kind of piece of woods you're going to find yourself in. So knowing how to deal with the different tinders, if you practice all on one kind of tinder, then that's really all you're going to be good at. But if you practice on 10 different tinders, you've just put a whole bunch of skill sets into your tool bag for when you're out in the bush. And that's how I've governed my life and my walk in the woods since I was a little boy. Now, granted, when I started this, I did not know all of the different tinders. And I probably still don't. After 50 years, one of my favorite things to do is to go for a hike in the wintertime and test different materials. And you'd be surprised what I find out in the woods, even at this stage in the game when I've been doing this for 50 years. You stumble across the bird's nest and you got a fire starter. It's the same thing with mushrooms. The white mushrooms that grow on white birch trees, or even just other types of, I don't know the mushrooms, but every once in a while you'll find one in the wintertime that's either on a dead tree or whatever. And if it's dead and dried out, you can pull that thing off and you can try it on your, with a fire rod. And I have got things to light with a fire rod within 2 or 3 smacks with that fire rod that I never knew. And only by experimenting, and I only experiment in the wintertime. I don't go out build fires in the summertime, and I recommend against that when you're out in the bush. In the wintertime, when I'm on snowshoes, I can build a fire anywhere, at any time, and it's never going to turn into a forest fire here in this state. Now, if you're in a state where there's no snow, then tread very lightly on your fire building. But I go out and I experiment with different things that are in my fire bag for lighting mushrooms, tree bark, and that's how I have learned a lot of this stuff. And if you need to move a fire, and I've done a video on it earlier, but that dried mushroom that's on a white birch tree, you can put a fire ember inside of that, and you can move your fire several miles before that piece of fungus will burn up. You just got to keep the oxygen away from it. You don't want to starve it, but you can put an ember in there. You can cover it up with some twigs or whatever just to slow the oxygen down. And now you can move your fire from point A to point B and still have a coal. And that's what I mean by experimenting with your fire tinders. So important to know how to build a fire out in the bush, especially in the state of Maine. Probably just like there's so much that's important to know about hanging out in a desert that I know absolutely nothing about. But I do know this, that if you come up here from the desert and think you're going to spend a night in the woods, you're going to be a hurting unit. Just like if I went to the desert, I would be a hurting unit. And I'm sure that in where you live or your country, there are tinders that you probably should get out and experiment with that aren't in the state of Maine, that I don't know anything about. But figure out what's in your neck of the woods, because that's how I have learned my piece of woods, is by going out, figuring out what's out there, finding my water sources, finding my tinder sources, where my white birch groves are. It's all part of the fun of being out in the bush here at the Rustic Log Cabin. So I want to thank you for coming along. If you like this kind of stuff about fire building and tinders, throw me a bone, subscribe to the channel, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you. I thoroughly enjoy the comments, so leave me a comment, and I definitely will answer your comment. So I will see you in the next one.